So why be religious? Why be Orthodox? I mean, I've actually been talking about this for a few years because, as I explained to my students, I have this at Fordham. We teach freshmen. We teach freshman theology, and this is one of the questions that I bring up in the class. And I tell them that the question of your generation isn't really why God. The question of your generation is why religion. Why be religious? I mean, what's the point? And so I think a related question to that then is sort of why be Orthodox, right? Why do it this way? So a little bit of context about this question, like how did it really emerge? I mean, one of the things it's important to understand, one of the things that's really important to understand is that prior to like the 1600s, no one in the world would have really questioned whether there was a God or whether there was something beyond us or whether there was a supernatural or something. No one would have questioned that. And after about the 1600s or so, mostly in Western Europe, a new question started to emerge, a very surprising kind of question. And it has something to do a little bit with the Protestant Reformation and the scientific revolution and Newton's kind of revolution in physics and some other things. But basically, what emerged was the question of why God? So that was like a big question kind of in the 18th and the 19th centuries. But the question of the day now, it isn't really why God, the question is why religion? Because if you look at the statistics, and there's some recent statistics that came out in the United States. The United States is still a pretty overwhelmingly spiritual country, I would call it. Because very high percentages of people, somewhere in the 80%, I think, actually believe in things like God and heaven and all those things that one might associate with belief in the transcendent, with the beyond. But over the past few decades, what's really gone down is identifying with a particular religion. So there's this famous word called the nuns, the N-O-N-E-S, right? Not the nuns, N-U-N-S, but N-O-N-E-S. And over the past decades, I mean, what that means is I don't affiliate with anything. And some might say I don't believe in anything, so therefore I don't affiliate. Some might say the very, very famous phrase, I'm sure you've heard of it, I'm spiritual but not religious, right? So one of the things you don't realize, or maybe we don't realize enough, is that that's a very recent phrase. That phrase only started really percolating in about the 80s. And one of the people that really made that phrase really, really famous is Madonna. She kind of had this turn towards the Jewish Kabbalah. So that's a kind of a real recent phrase, right? And so if we look at the statistics, about 30% of Americans identify as the N-O-N-E-S, which is pretty high. Pretty high in comparison to Americans in the 50s or the 40s or whatever. But one of the things that's happened recently, and this is kind of important because we don't really know where it's going to go, but apparently Christianity used to be 90% of the country at its founding, and now it's somewhere in the 46% range. But or maybe it's a little bit higher. Maybe it's a little bit higher, about 60% actually. So it's a little bit. I'm thinking of another statistic. So it's about in the 60% range. But if you think it went from like 99% to about 60% over 250 years. I mean, that indicates something. We've become a lot more religiously plural country, but we also have more and more people who are just not basically saying I just don't identify. And in terms of young people, that statistic of I don't identify has gone up to about 40, somewhere between 40 and 45%. So it's a little bit higher than the average. So, but the statistics indicate that this country is still overwhelmingly spiritual. So they're spiritual, but they're not really choosing religion. Now that may change. Trends change. We hear a lot about young men sort of entering the Orthodox Church. There are new statistics that show that men are more likely now, young men are more likely to become religious, and young women are more likely not to become religious. So it's still kind of shifting and changing. But the one thing that hasn't changed, and the one thing that is a new thing over the past few decades, is the question, why religion? Why do we even need it? Why can't I just do it alone? Why can't I do it in my bedroom, right? Why do I need to do it with this infrastructure? Why do I need to do it with this institution? Especially, and this is a common complaint, especially when we see religions being responsible for what seems to be some of the bad things in the world. So, now I could do kind of a broad thing about why being religious, but I'm going to kind of focus on why be Orthodox. Why be Orthodox? And I hope that, I hope that I kind of offer, I guess what I'm trying to do is really offer you an answer to the question, right? So if anybody really asks you why you're religious, maybe, the Father is recording this and you can watch the video again, but maybe hopefully I can offer you some ways in which to answer the question, right? In terms of answering the question. So let me begin with let me begin, first of all, what I think is a common misconception about Christianity, but what I also think is a common misconception about religion in general. And I hear this from my students all the time. The common misconception about Christianity and the common misconception about religion is that it really is just about following rules to either get a reward or to avoid punishment. So it's really about following rules. Following rules. If I follow the rules, I'm going to get to heaven. If I don't follow the rules, I'm going to go to hell. So this is a very common, again, what I'm calling misconception about religion and especially about our Orthodox faith. I know that's going to sound shocking, right? So isn't our Orthodox faith about rules? It's all about the rules. Isn't it all about fasting, which we're doing tonight? Isn't it all about this reward or this punishment we get after we die? And I'm here to tell you that no, I don't actually think it's about that. Right? I don't think it's about that. So, and there's a lot of ways I can talk about this, but let me kind of focus on one thing here, as an example, right? As an example. So, we started Lent Monday, and there's a pre-Lenten period. And so prior to Monday, 4 Sundays before Monday, the Monday where Lent starts, the church, in its hymns and in its gospel readings, starts telling us that Lent is on the way. Right? It's the only time in the church where you're getting this kind of preparatory period. Lent is on the way. Get ready. There's a Christmas fast for 40 days, and there's no preparatory period. In fact, when Christmas fast starts, there's nothing in the Bible readings, in the hymns, or anything that actually signals that the Christmas fast has started. But for this Lent, 4 Sundays prior to Clean Monday, the church is trying to get us ready, trying to prepare us. And it prepares us with, on Sundays especially, with 4 gospel readings. And the 4 gospel readings, the first one is the publican and the Pharisee. And in the publican and the Pharisee, we know that story, where the Pharisee says to God, thank you, God, I'm so great, I've done all the rules, I'm not, like this guy over there. And of course, the publican is like, I am that guy, I'm sorry, right? And we know the moral of the story there is that obviously the one that receives the mercy, the one that shows humility, you can do all the rules you want, but if you're going to kind of show it off or demean others, then it really doesn't matter to anything. And then you have the story of the prodigal son after that, right? So we're on our way to Lent. We're on our way, and you have the story of the prodigal son. And in the story of the prodigal son, we know that the father embraces the one who left, the son that left. But then you have the brother. Everybody knows the brother, right? The brother who did everything the father wanted. Did everything. Checked the list off. And went and complained. And you know what? He had a justified complaint. A justified complaint. He said, you know what? I've been working really hard for you. Did everything you asked me to do without complaint. And here you are, the fatted calf for this guy who left, squandered your money, and I never got a fatted calf. And of course, he's right. He's absolutely right. But at the same time, again, you can do all the rules you want, and if it somehow doesn't increase your capacity to love, then it's not really worth anything. It's not really worth anything. It increases your capacity to love even when you see someone come back having squandered and there's a festival for them, right? And there's a festival for them. But so then you have and so we're on our way to Lent, right? So we have publican, Pharisee, prodigal son, and then we have this gospel of the last judgment. And we all know that story, right? Jesus separates, and he separates using sort of the criteria: did you come feed me? Did you clothe me when I was naked? Did you visit me in prison? So, did you visit me in prison? So we're going to be judged by how we treat people who break the rules. We're going to be judged by how we treat people who break the rules. And then finally, this past Sunday right before Clean Monday, Jesus talks about fasting. And he says, make sure you do your fasting in secret. Don't be a show-off. But then he talks about forgiveness. He talks about forgiveness. The Sunday before Lent, he talks about forgiveness. The church has a gospel reading where Jesus talks about forgiveness. And he says, where your treasure is, that's where your heart is going to be. So obviously the message is that Jesus wants our treasure to be forgiveness. He wants our heart to be a forgiving one. So whatever Lent is about, it's about forgiveness. It's about forgiveness. And that's driven home, and I love this in the church, you know, the way the church has structured its readings and everything is just so wise, and sometimes it gets really missed. At the Anastasi service at night, right before we start the Divine Liturgy, so we have the Christos Anesti and coming out with the candles and the Christos Anesti, and then so right before we start the Divine Liturgy, we sing a hymn, and the hymn starts off, "It is the day of resurrection. Let us rejoice in it." And one of the lines in there, right before the liturgy, is, let us embrace those, even those who hate us, and let us forgive all things in the resurrection. Let us forgive all things in the resurrection. So Lent is about forgiveness. It's not about rules. It may seem like it's about rules, but we can fast and do all the rules and put checklists and do all kinds of things. And really the Christian life, the Orthodox Christian life, what it really has in view is not a contract with God. It's not to treat God transactionally. What the Christian life has in view is to increase our capacity to love and to forgive. And forgiveness really is a form of love. So somehow to increase our capacity, to notice that we can do it more, to notice that we can extend it more. And all these things that we do, fasting, coming to the services, sacraments, coming to liturgy, reading the Bible. All those are kind of ways in which the church is trying to help us along. There are ways in which the church is trying to help us along. Because to love, to increase our capacity to love as God loves in the world, it's not easy. And I think God recognizes that. It's really not easy. You know, the fathers of the church kind of talk about this in a way that, especially someone like St. Maximus the Confessor, this great saint of the 7th century, and he says things like, if you notice something like fear or hatred or anger in your heart, you realize that you are far from the love of God. It's not a condemnation. It's more of an observation. It's not a condemnation. It's more of an observation. It's like, if you notice these things going on in you, just realize that you're far from the love of God. And that's where you're at. And maybe that's where you can begin to change. By simple recognition of that. By simple honest recognition of that. So it's not a condemnation. It's not meant to be like, oh, I'm feeling anger or hatred, or I'm such a bad person, And, it's not about self-criticism. We get enough of that with social media. It's not about self-criticism. It's just simply noticing, like, maybe it can be different. And I think, if anything, that is like, I know it's going to be so simple, but that is sort of the core of Jesus' message. It can be different. It can be otherwise. It doesn't have to be this way. So when we notice like fear and anger and hatred, those things don't really exist with love. And so part of our journey, part of our work on ourselves is to kind of figure out how we can move in that particular kind of direction. So really our journey is about movement. It's not static contract. It's about movement. And again, all these things, of course, there are rules. There are, we have fasting rules and other kinds of rules and things like that. So I'm not anti-rule. It's just that these rules are kind of they've been created as frameworks within which we can kind of move ourselves towards becoming more loving human beings in the world. Because, St. Athanasius the Great in the 4th century had this wonderful line, which also is a really great summary of our faith. He said, God became human so that humans can become gods. To become God. We call it in our language, in our Orthodox language, theosis, or deification. But, we get misunderstood, and sometimes it's even misunderstood within our own church, because theosis, or deification makes it sound like we're kind of Superman, right? Kind of like Zeus on Mount Olympus, or Thor with his hammer, right? Or that to become God is to kind of just always kind of like do these supernatural kinds of acts or something like that. But the number one name that we give to God, the absolute, because there's a lot of names we give to God. God is a name. We say God is good, benevolent, all-powerful, all-knowing, simple, one, all those things. All those are names. But the number one name we give to God, and this is what Jesus taught us, is love. So to become like God is not to become Superman. It's not to show how great you are and to, kind of use your authority over people and to demean them or to make them afraid or whatever. To become like God is to love as God loves. And God always loves us. In our center we have this wonderful series called Scholars Preach, Orthodox Scholars Preach. And Father Harry did it, I think last year or the year before. And this past Sunday we had one, you can find this on our YouTube page. And the priest monk who gave the sermon, who's also a scholar, he said this wonderful line, which I've never heard it quite put this way before, saying that, especially in sort of doing things in such a way that somehow we're trying to convince God to love us, right? Like if I do the fast super strictly or all these things, that somehow God's going to love me more. He said, you can never convince God to love you more than God already does. You can never convince God to love you more than God already does. So if God loves us that way all the time, all the time, the trick then is on our part to clear the path to figure out how, in fact, we can experience that love that is just always there. It's just always there. It's there for everyone. Even someone who does the most heinous thing, it's there. God doesn't necessarily let that person off the hook, but God does love them. Be sure of that. Because God doesn't reduce them to their worst act. God doesn't reduce them to their worst act. And remember, Jesus really upped the ante because, of course, love brother and stranger and family and so on and so forth, but he upped the ante to enemy and stranger. Enemy and stranger. That's kind of upping it a little bit. So the real question, and I'm sort of getting to the broader question of why be Orthodox. So I think if we can, I guess where I'm going with this is that if one way to maybe tackle this question is if we can just sort of tear down the misconceptions that religion or orthodoxy really isn't about rules, but it's really about a relationship with God in such a way that the closer we get to God, the more God is in us. And the more God is in us, the more we can love. Because God is love, right? So if we love, that means if we can love more, that means we have God more. So the real goal of being Orthodox is not to go to heaven and show God a checklist that says, I've done everything you asked of me, so let me in. So the real goal is for us to be close with God. Just like being close with each other. I mean, it's really no different, right? We work to be close with one another in different kinds of ways. And the same work we do to kind of be close with one another, we have to do something. We have to do something to be close with our God. And so let me kind of illustrate this a little bit more, and then I do this example in class and I thought about it when I was binging on The Sopranos, so forgive me for the example, but I have a neighbor, let's pretend. It is pretend. I have a neighbor and I hate my neighbor. And I just recognize that. I observe it, I recognize it, I can't pretend it's not there, it's just, I really hate my neighbor. And I avoid my neighbor, I don't want to talk to my neighbor, I don't want anything to do with my neighbor. But my neighbor comes over and says, I'm in trouble, I need $5,000, otherwise I'm going to get whacked. So the Sopranos reference. So I'm in a pickle. So I give my neighbor the $5,000. Now the question I always ask my students is, has the neighbor fulfilled the greatest commandment? To love God with all your heart, mind, and soul, and to love your neighbor as yourself. That's the greatest commandment. And my students are astute, well, no, because he hates the neighbor still. See, and that's where the rubber hits the road, right? Because that's where some of our great saints and our great ascetics, they understood this. You can't just switch off the hatred switch. You can't just kind of wake up one morning and be like, oh, let me turn off the hatred switch. You can't do that, right? You have to acknowledge it, right? Acknowledge it's there, because if you try to pretend it's not there, that's not going to help. And then you have to try to figure out, like, how can this be different? How can this be different? And, it can be different because that's when we start to realize it can be different, not by automatically willing myself not to feel hatred, not to turn off a switch of some sorts, but something has to be done, right? Something has to be done. And one of the very simplest things that could be done is to simply, it sounds so simple, right? It's simply to spend more time with the neighbor, right? Just spend more time with the neighbor. You just might learn something, notice something, get a bigger picture, get a bigger story. You might realize you might have projected things on them in ways that were unfair. And you might just notice that maybe you're feeling a little bit less hatred, which is good. Which is good. If it's a little bit less, that's good. You're on the right road, right? And maybe, who knows, maybe over time, you might notice that you actually enjoy your neighbor's company. Or you might actually notice that you kind of want to go over there or invite them over. But none of that can happen unless you kind of walk over and spend more time. And of course, it is a two-way street, but what I'm trying to get at is there is a way in which we can notice ourselves move from anger and hatred and fear toward love. There is a way in which we can notice that. And we notice that by doing certain kinds of practices, right? One of them is just simple communication, right? Simple being with one another, simple presence, right? Simple sort of benefit of the doubt. And I think what I'm getting at is that, so we have this metaphor in the church that basically says that the church is like a hospital, right? It's there to kind of go, you're sick, and you kind of go to be healed. But if we constantly say the church is like a hospital, which there is that, and I want to affirm the metaphor, but if that's all we have, then it's kind of one of those things where it's a hospital, we go to be healed, but if it's a hospital, then we're kind of also all constantly reminding ourselves that we're sick. And it doesn't really point the finger towards maybe what's possible for us. And so the metaphor that I like, I think I like it just a little bit more, is that the church is really a training ground, right? It's a training ground. It's a training to learn how to love. It's a training ground to be closer to God, how to be closer to God. And all these things like the rules and the frame and the liturgies in the Bible and the text and all these other things, these are kind of frameworks that any good training must really have, right? So if you think of, for example, and I can go anywhere here with this, but if you think of an artistic training, right? So Fordham has a relationship with this school down the block called the Alvin Ailey School. And it's a very famous dance school. Now, if I walked into Alvin Ailey and I said, I want to be a dancer, right? So I want to dance, I want to live forever. Does anyone remember that movie, Fame, right? I have a crowd that remembers that movie. Now my Gen Zers have no idea. I didn't realize how famous that movie was, but it was filmed like right down the block. So anyway, so if I go into Alvin Ailey now and I say, look, I want to learn how to dance, and I know nothing about dance, well, they're going to start me at the beginner's level. But they have a framework of training. Now, let me back up for a second. Let me back up. So I think I'm going to make this point again at the end. But there's got to be a reason why I pick Alvin Ailey. There's got to be a reason why I pick it. And I pick it because I've seen Alvin Ailey dancers dance. And when I see Alvin Ailey dancers dance, it kind of evokes trust. Like this place is a good training ground, right? But once I go and commit myself, I've got to trust their training. And that training entails rules. It entails beginner's practices, right? So I'm at the beginner's level, right? I'm just starting out. There's a teacher guiding me. There's a community of other people there. I'm kind of excited, it's new. And then I kind of move towards the intermediate level. I'm still in it, I'm still into this, I'm still enthused about it, I still believe in it. And I go to the intermediate level. And at the intermediate level, I start noticing things I didn't really maybe notice the first year. Start noticing that not everybody's there for the right reason. Some want to do it for fame. Others want to do it for the sake of dance. Not all the teachers are great. Some are better than others. That surprises me a little bit, but I still trust this place and I still trust the training. And the intermediate level has certain kinds of rules that the beginner's levels didn't have. And then I go to the advanced level. And then I really get to know sort of the place, the institution of the place, because there's politics involved. Not all the people that deserve to get on stage get on stage. I realize there's a board. They have to make decisions about property and paying the bills and other kinds of things. I hear there's politics in the board. There's all kinds of, there seems to be in this institution all these very ugly non-dance things going on. All these ugly non-dance things going on. But somehow I stick with the training. And I notice that something that's different is going on. I'm becoming a dancer. I'm actually being a dancer. And I get to go on stage, and when I'm on stage, I'm a little bit nervous because I'm afraid people are watching me, and I might make a mistake, and I don't want to make a fool out of myself, but then eventually I can perform in such a way where I'm not really thinking about it. I've done the practices so many times that it just becomes almost kind of natural to me. Like my body has absorbed everything in such a way that it's so natural to me. And maybe, just maybe, I could become one of those dancers like Alvin Ailey. Alvin Ailey is kind of really sort of just almost like a saint of the tradition, of the dance tradition, because he does things in continuity with the tradition, but also sees a way in which it can something different can occur. So he's not breaking the tradition, he's just in continuity, but seeing maybe something a little bit different. So in spite of all the ugly non-dance things going on, there's still kind of this beauty that's preserved within the institution. There's this beauty of the tradition, the beauty of the training, and the beauty of the dancers. And it's watching those dancers that makes me recommit and believe in this training. It's no different in the church. It's absolutely no different in the church. To be Orthodox, that's the goal, right? Is to engage in a training where we trust the tradition, in spite of all the non-church ugliness that we witness in the parish and the larger sphere and the global sphere, like what Russia's doing in relationship to Ukraine and things like that. We still trust the training because it produces these great figures like Mother Maria Skoptsova of Paris or Saint Seraphim of Sarov or so many other really luminous lights of love in the world. I don't know if you know Saint Mother Maria Skoptsova, but she was a saint in Paris in the 40s, came from Russia, worked all her life, she worked tirelessly for the poor in Paris, but then also hid Jews from the Nazis and was ultimately murdered in a concentration camp for that. So you have people like that, and you look at people like that, and you have to trust the training. And I would say that to answer the question, like, why be Orthodox? I mean, it's very similar to why do I want to be an Ailey dancer? I mean, it's unthinkable, really, to think about. It's unthinkable to imagine being an Ailey dancer on your own. It's absolutely unthinkable. Maybe some people have natural talents and maybe can skip some of the levels, but they're just not going to come out of nowhere and be put on the stage. And I think the church has the Orthodox tradition, which we see being carried forward within the church, meaning the parish, the archdiocese, the institution. This tradition is one in which it's pointing to a training of learning how to love. That's what it means to be Orthodox. It doesn't mean to be Orthodox to follow the fast very strictly. It doesn't mean to be Orthodox to come all the services. Again, like the brother in the prodigal said, you can do all that, but if somehow you're not finding yourself with the capacity to embrace and to look at the enemy and the stranger in that kind of embrace, then all that is not working, right? So there's a sense in which this training has to have in view this beautiful goal of becoming more loving in the world. Not simply a contract, not simply for fame and for recognition. And we look at those great saints, those great luminaries who actually embody that, crystallize it. And our goal isn't to become saints, there's very few of them. But our goal is, as much as we can, whatever situation we're in, whatever bodies we have, wherever we are geographically, is to learn how to love. And the Orthodox Church provides that training. That would have been my answer to the question. You want to learn how to love? The Orthodox Church is a place where you can engage in that training. It's not going to be smooth sailing, but maybe that's the point. Maybe part of the point of learning how to love is to deal with when things aren't smooth sailing. So that's all I have. Thank you.
Your questions, comments, and I would ask, because we only have one mic, that
I can repeat it.
kind of paraphrase,
Yeah.
Summarize those for
Yeah.
the recording.
I can do that.
Can I just offer a couple of comments and stuff that I found, a couple of quotes regarding forgiveness. Two of them I had. The first one is, to forgive is to set a prisoner free and discover that the prisoner was you.
Yeah.
I'll repeat that.
Yeah.
To forgive is to set a prisoner free and to discover that the prisoner was you.
Yeah. That's perfect.
And then the second one kind of ties in and reminds me of the older son and the prodigal, which you kind of think he didn't really do. Forgiveness is not a feeling. It's a decision to offer grace instead of demanding justice.
Yeah. Yeah. I think forgiveness is a kind of state of being. Forgiveness is really hard. Mm-hmm. It's very, very hard. I'm not going to minimize that. And but there's a lot of, we had a student at Fordham who worked on a dissertation on forgiveness, and she told a wonderful story of in Rwanda, and of people there, and some people who have suffered atrocities actually facing their perpetrators. People who had people in their family die and facing the perpetrator, and stories of people going up to these perpetrators and being like, you know what, I'm not ready to forgive you yet, but still somehow encountering them, right? And other things would happen and so on and so forth, and then over time, some people did notice that they were ready to do that. So forgiveness is one of those things you kind of notice, and that noticing is when that decision has occurred for you, I think. But forgiveness is hard. Real forgiveness is very hard.
What I like about the one about extending grace,
Mm.
because it acknowledges that sometimes, and even Jesus on the cross, said it acknowledges that injustices were done to you.
Yeah. Yeah.
And to own that, and that's okay. But what you're doing is so you don't minimize that.
Right.
And you don't say forgive or forget. Forget.
Right.
But you're saying it's like, okay, you know what, this did happen to me, but I'm choosing and stuff to extend the grace, rather than demanding the justice.
Yeah.
And expecting that person to get an apology.
No, I agree, and I think it's definitely not. Forgive and forget doesn't make any sense, because if real forgiveness happens between two people, then they something kind of new has been created in that relationship, but it's been new because of the bad thing that happened. So it doesn't really get forgotten. I mean, it may not come to your memory all the time, and you may not constantly use it against somebody. It doesn't. It's there though. It doesn't. So forgive and forget is just not a great phrase. But I agree also that real forgiveness entails acknowledgement that something bad has happened. I totally agree with that. And in many ways, sometimes all acknowledgement is all the justice that people really want. I mean, that has happened in many cases.
I was just going to say, on a small scale, I sometimes am someone who people wouldn't necessarily know this, but I can get irritated at other people driving in my car. So they don't know I'm irritated. Or things like this where they're not going to know that I'm irritated.
Yeah.
But I will find myself catching myself saying, what are you doing?
Yeah, that's good.
And then thinking, whether it's someone who today was incredibly rude to me, but then thinking, they probably didn't even know they were.
Yeah, that's.
And you know what? She seems stressed. And so she's probably having a very difficult day,
Right.
and I need to just be thoughtful of this other person and let it go.
That's.
And it's just a way of just little small steps on my part, as opposed to the big forgiveness. Those happen, I think, a little less frequently.
I agree. I think the small steps is where it starts, like with the example of the fake, mob guy. It's you just walk over, you just walk over. It's as simple as that, right? And I do think, I do think that's a practice you'll see somehow in the fathers of the church, where the irritation, take a step back and think about the wider picture. But that can also be difficult, right? So for some people, they're kind of caught up in a certain, and that's okay. It's not about condemnation. It's just about being honest about where you're at, because you can't move towards God unless you're honest about where you're at.
Right, and it said something about me that I got irritated.
Right. So and it's not about condemnation either. So it's not about being hard on yourself, self-criticizing yourself, kind of self-flagellating yourself. It's just simply being honest about where you're at, because it's from there that you progress towards God, not from some imagined other place. You have to be honest about where you're at. And even that first step can be very difficult. Can be very, very difficult for some. But that's why it's done with, again, a framework, with relationships, with guidance, it's meant to be a kind of relational effort, so to speak. Well.
How do you promote the message of love in a society and the leaders that we have in this country who promote hatred and division?
Yeah, that's a good question.
Repeat the question.
How do you promote love in a society that's so divided, and there are leaders in this country and all over the world that don't necessarily promote love, and they promote hatred. So there's a little bit of a trick when you think about someone that you really get really angry about, that provokes anger in you, right? Or in us, I should say, in all of us. in someone. Let me put it that way. There's a kind of a trick, and you know, it's trying to, without letting them off the hook for things that they're doing wrong. It's kind of a trick where you kind of you kind of imagine, you really imagine them doing something nice, right? You imagine them like playing baseball with their kids. And it's really kind of interesting because that trick actually works, right? It can kind of tone down and get you maybe to see something a little bit bigger than perhaps what's always kind of presented, right? So I would say that might be a first step, right, in terms of what we can do, what I can do for myself, especially when I encounter people that really evoke, especially in sort of the political world, that kind of anger and even hatred at times, right? And then the other two things I would say, and this is going to sound a little bit trite, right? I mean, it's going to sound trite, but you can only really worry about your corner of the world, right? So you have to just model, or at least you have to just, not model, you have to just recognize that that's the journey you're on, and you're doing the best you can toward that journey and still learning and trying to figure out how to move in that direction. And in a way, I think that will then model that journey. That journey will be modeled for others, right? But then we can also just simply speak a different message, right? We can speak a different message. Like we can speak a different message, especially like in the political realm, in the cultural realm, where, you know, if in fact our journey is to kind of learn how to love, then learning how to love in this public sphere means maybe dealing with things and dealing with people that we disagree with, or dealing with laws that we disagree with, or dealing with, you know, putting ourselves into that realm of debate and conflict in such a way where we resist the urge to demonize. So I do think there are things that we can do. Let me put it another way. So, if in fact the challenge is to learn how to love, then these kinds of situations are exactly the challenge to learning how to love, right? And so we should embrace them as in fact the very things that challenge us in our journey to learn how to love. But learning how to love does not mean stopping your voice. Learning how to love doesn't mean speaking for what you think is right. Learning your love doesn't mean criticizing something that you think is wrong at the political sphere. It doesn't mean any of those things. But I always, you know, so in our tradition, we have this tradition of, especially in the 4th century, monastics going to the desert and really trying to work on their relationship with God, right? I always think that the political sphere is the desert in which we have to work on learning how to love. In other words, that we're like monks in the political world. And we're, you know, that world is just challenging us at its height to somehow figure out how to love as God loves in the world. But of course, loving as God loves in the world is a demand for justice and for what's right and things like that. So it's not giving up on your ideals, it's just perhaps resisting the urge to polarize and demonize. Resisting the urge to polarize and demonize.
Other comments, questions? So, one question.
Sure.
I'm sorry, I had to step out.
No worries.
A little bit.
Mm-hmm.
So, what would you list as the ways the Orthodox tradition excels in training strategies? What do we have that you can't find in the Catholic Church or Anglican Church?
I don't like to frame things that way.
Okay.
I like to be like, you know, like, I don't, like, in other words, if I want to be an Alvin Ailey dancer, I don't have to trash the New York City Ballet, right? I don't have to do that. I just trust this tradition, and I believe that it can lead me towards union with God and loving God more. And I don't have to to have that confidence. I don't have to condemn, right? Confidence doesn't mean you have to condemn. So, but I think like I said, I wrote something on fasting, and that's one of the things I think we do right. I think the sacrament of confession, understood correctly, is something that leads in that direction, because, like I said, you can't move towards a loving union with God if you're not honest with yourself. And I think confession is a place where we have to really just be honest with ourselves. And it's not easy because you're having to tell it to another human being. So it's easy to kind of go into your room and confess and whatever, because no one's there face to face, So confession, I think is one of those. Obviously, the sacramental life, especially in terms of the Eucharist. And then I would say, everybody has to go a little bit of digging, right? Because there are these wonderful spiritual writings of the spiritual giants and saints, including women and men, who are really have worked hard to try to move in this direction, and we need to seek their advice, right? We need to maybe read Mother Maria Skopsova, or read Saint Sophrony, recent saint in UK and Essex, or Saint Porphyrios and others as well. Not with necessarily having to agree with everything they say, because the saints can also be wrong. The only one who was never ever wrong was Jesus, right? So we do have our own conscience, our own discernment in play. We don't have our own judgment in play, right? But in relationship with one another, with a spiritual father, drawing on the writings of these really great masters to help us along the way, because they've also encountered the same human challenges we did in terms of learning how to love, right? And Anthony Bloom is another one, I think. So I think those areas what to call the ascetical life, but is normally thought of in terms of just monks and monathos, really. But the really kind of the being human is always to engage in some kind of asceticism, right? If you're going to work really hard to get a particular kind of job, that's an asceticism. If you're going to work really hard to get a particular kind of body, that's an asceticism, right? So there's really no non-ascetical living. What we need to do is find the kind of asceticism that ultimately helps us to notice that we're moving away from fear, anger, and hatred, and more towards an extended capacity to love and forgive. Did you have a question?
I just want to clarify. I wasn't asking in condemning.
Right. No, I know.
But because sometimes people are searching.
Yeah.
And they haven't found something in a different tradition.
No, I know.
They come to the...
Yeah, and I understand that. But I wouldn't. I understand that. I guess my approach, and it's just mine, is that I would just focus on the confidence I have within this tradition, and not necessarily compare it to others. Did you have a question?
Yeah.
I just wanted to follow up with what Father Harry had said earlier, and he's kind of clarifying it now, but your response was, well, you don't want to condemn. I was thinking it wasn't a matter of condemning, it was a matter of why do we prefer to be Orthodox as opposed to being Catholic?
That's a question only each of you can ask yourselves, right? I have an answer to that for me, right? But that's a question that each of you have to kind of answer for yourselves.
Can you repeat the question?
The question is, why is it that we prefer to be Orthodox rather than Catholic? And I would say that each of you have to answer that question on your own. Yeah.
As some of us in this room have.
Yeah.
As I'm not the only convert in the room.
Yeah.
And truth be told, people have left the Orthodox Church and gone elsewhere.
Right.
We don't talk about that very much.
Well, and I would say that there's something about Orthodox that wasn't. There's just something that was missed. And I'm not blaming anybody involved. I'm just saying something was missed, because honestly, when you really start to really see how it all kind of crystallizes into a kind of training program to learn how to love, then I just don't. And a kind of training that really, kind of a love that's kind of an openness to the world as well. I mean, not being afraid of other forms of knowledge or other forms of therapy or this or that or whatever. I just think it's really, really, might be the wrong word to use, but orthodoxy is very seductive in that sense. But, we have to be able to hit on the right points. Because today people are converting because the great Byzantine Empire and sort of having the banners and the flags and the Tsar was great, and that's just not a good reason to be Orthodox. Because that's just not really what it's about.
So could you comment on the phenomenon, more specifically in America, of especially white young men attracted to the Orthodox Church? What, in your observation, is healthy? What is unhealthy about this dynamic?
Yeah, I don't have enough information and statistics. I do know that there has been some reports that has something to do with reinforcing certain kind of traditional gender roles, seeing a certain way of seeing sort of how Christianity should be kind of the dominant political system in the way it was in Tsarist Russia, or, and I don't really know why everybody converts, right? So it could be some of those things, and things like I love the icons and I love the liturgy, which are great things, right? So it could be a mix of those things, right? But there are reports of people coming over because it does seem to be this more traditional in the sense of reinforcing certain kinds of norms, mostly patriarchal norms, that we've kind of moved away from in this country. So I guess my view of that is that, maybe, if they're going to come in, even for those reasons, then it's an opportunity to show them what Orthodoxy is really about. But you need the right guidance. Alan Ailey is a great dance school with, great trainers and great teachers, but it also has probably some bad teachers too. Where you're not necessarily getting the kind of training that you should be getting. And if Alan Ailey had like little satellite, dance schools, it could be that one of those dance schools isn't necessarily providing the right kind of training. So a lot depends on who you meet and who you encounter and what you read. So I would draw on the ascetics who were really trying to learn how to love, and what I mean by that is try to become closer to God. Because when you're loving, it's really not about power. It's really not. It's the opposite. And Jesus on the cross is the prime example of that. So. Tough questions. Tough crowd. No, it's been great to be here. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So on that last note, we have good reading material for you before you leave, if you'd like to take some. Our booklet rack, our little pamphlet rack with free, all kinds of great stuff for reading, small little things. One little table with books you can purchase on topics that are appropriate to Lent. Another one with books from our library you can borrow. So let us all rise to close with prayer. I'll offer one of my favorite hymns of Lent from the great Compline service that we do on Mondays. Sing it first in English, then in Greek. Lord of the powers, be with For in times of distress we have no other helper but you, Lord of the powers, have mercy on us. Kyrie ton dinameon methimon yenu alon garectos uvoithon enthlipsesin uk echo men Kyrie ton dinameon eleison imas. A blessed Lent to everyone.